Welcome. I'm Max Donath, and I am essentially in charge of the seminar series. I welcome you all here. We're having a few little glitches with the live webcast. We have extra special security in this room, and guess what? That security causes some problems with firewalls and the like. But everything is being recorded, so those of you who are interested can certainly share with your buddies, and they can take a look at this webcast at a delayed point. We are opening it with Brad Estoshan, and I'll introduce him shortly, but I just want to first let you know that students can register for this seminar course. It is listed as Civil Engineering 8213 or Mechanical Engineering 8772 or Public Affairs 8290. So you can register for 1 credit, and 5 of those semesters you have to submit a 1-page summary of that seminar. Not an onerous requirement, but the details are spelled out in the syllabus. There are copies of the syllabus on the table off to the side, and I suggest you take a look at it carefully in order to see exactly what the requirements are. My assistant for this course is Hannah Grun. Can you please stand up? Okay, so Hannah will be dealing with some of the details of the seminar, and I'm going to invite her to say a few words in a few moments. Let me first let you know that I have a microphone, and you obviously aren't hearing anything over the speakers. The purpose of the microphone is to make sure that people out in TV land can hear what we have to say. So by the same token, any of you who have a question, if we want our audience to hear your question, we have to use a microphone, okay? Nobody will hear you if you just talk in the room in the back. So let me just point that out to you. Hannah, do you want to say some words about the details?
We'll be taking questions from the live audience as well as you guys here in the room. I want to note for everybody that's here, please sign in on the sign-in sheet, which is located at the table over that way. We also have a syllabus for students in the room and a copy of all the seminars that will be taking place over this semester. And please hold all your questions until the end, and we'll be passing around this microphone at that point. Thanks.
And I don't want to belabor the various speakers that are coming to talk. I will later, after the seminar is over, I'll introduce the speaker for next week, who's actually sitting here in the room, but we'll hold off on that till later. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Brad Estoshan. I've known Brad since he first arrived at Minnesota DOT in 1999, and he's been with them ever since. Just want to let you know that he's also a volunteer fireman, an EMT, and has worked in a variety of different positions at the Minnesota DOT. He's worked in maintenance operations, worked with the snowplow groups, he's worked in the ITS group. He was involved in dealing with the I-35W bridge collapse and the response to that particular issue. And he's been the state traffic safety engineer for the last 5 years. So he is eminently qualified to talk to us about Minnesota's strategic highway safety plan. So without further ado, you're on.
Thanks. All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, and if you're a traffic safety engineer, you know what it is, but not too many people here are probably traffic safety engineers. I think there's about 50 of them in the state, and they're in the United States. So we'll talk a little bit about what the SHSP is and how it fits in the overall context of delivering a transportation safety program. I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about how we got stakeholder input into developing this plan. And how do we engage the safety community to help present this plan. So it's not only a plan for MnDOT, but but it's also a plan for basically the state of Minnesota. And so it doesn't have to be a government agency. You don't have to be a DOT official in order to have a stake in implementing this plan. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about coordination. What's this mean? The plan's only so good if it sits on the shelf and says, oh, it's good. We're going to update this 5 years later and kind of work with that. But how's the SHSP, where does it stand in terms of a hierarchy, and how does it impact other plans and programs throughout the state? And then lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's your role. Everybody here probably has a role in implementing the Strategic Highway Safety Plan. And hopefully at the end of the day, you'll walk out here thinking, hey, this is how I fit individually into implementing activities that support the Strategic Highway Safety Plan. Framework, they said, you know what, we should have a national goal. A national goal that says we're going to develop a target, and we're going to work towards reducing the number of people that are killed on our roadways. And so the initial framework was kind of floated out there saying, hey, this is a way to really get focused and hone in on something that's good for everybody. And since that first framework was developed in 1998, it was revisited and evaluated a couple different times, and the guidance was updated in 2005. And in that guidance in 2005, it came up with a specific goal. It says, you know what, we want to kill no more than one person per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. So that came out in 2005, and they thought, you know what, we'll be able to get that accomplished in 5 years. Last year, our fatality rate was 1.1 fatalities per 1 million vehicle miles, so we still have about a 10% reduction that we're trying to do to get at a goal that was established about 7 years ago. And so the other thing that this national framework did is it came up and said, you know what, let's look at the universe or the context of motor vehicle crashes. And said, you know what, we've got 22 focus areas that cover the gamut of things that could be involved in a motor vehicle crash. And I'm literally going to throw them up on the screen here. And there's 20 of them up here. We kind of lumped a few of them together in terms of lane departure. They have head-on crashes, lane departure, and failure to navigate the roadway as 3 different ones. So we bumped that into lane departure. But as you can see, we've got things that involve vehicles, things that involve drivers, things that involve the roadway, and a whole different thing. So if you think of any motor vehicle crash, I'm willing to bet that it'll fit in at least one of those circles that are up there. And so really what we'll talk about is ways to focus in on certain activities or certain areas to make improvements. But in the past, we've focused on individual circles. And I think that we're going to talk a little bit today about how we can leverage the commonalities between some of these activities. And that's really the goal and objective that we're looking for in terms of moving forward, in terms of reducing our fatal and serious injury crashes. So in Minnesota, every state by federal law has to develop a strategic highway safety plan. So we took the national framework and leveraged that into developing our first plan in 2004. And at the time, it wasn't a requirement, so we developed it with something that was called the Comprehensive Highway Safety Plan. And it was our first attempt at trying to really get structured around the notion of being focused and driven towards reducing fatal and serious injury crashes. Being a leader has its strengths. It also comes with some risks. And when we developed that first comprehensive highway safety plan, guidance for what should be in that safety plan came out after 2004. And so we had to update our plan to be compliant with federal law in 2007. And that plan really set the stage for us to make some very, very substantial gains in terms of focusing our resources and energy into getting the best benefit and reduction of our crashes. And a couple things I'll highlight from that 2007 plan is we use the data exclusively to drive where we should focus our energy and resources. In the past, it was kind of a hodgepodge of how we would invest our federal safety dollars into a variety of things, but this really drove the data down to certain levels and said, here are things that we need to do. We need to help eliminate crashes on the local roadways because people die on local roads just like they die on state roads. And it really focused in on the types of crashes and the types of activities. And really the framework was established in there to say, you know what, we need to get some technical assistance to our local agencies. Because when we look at local agencies, they have a lot of things they're trying to balance. The city engineers, the county engineers, they're responsible for potholes. They're responsible for buying property to expand the roadways. And a lot of times they don't have the staff or the capabilities to really dig into things from a safety exclusive level and say, hey, this is going to be my safety program. It's just kind of something they do in the normal process of their entire framework. And so that was what was established in 2007, and we operated under that plan up until last year when we finally updated and adopted the plan in 2014. When I talk about success, this is how we measure our success. You know, we look at the numbers and we say, hey, this is what we're trying to do. And so in Minnesota we have what's called a Towards Zero Deaths program. It's an overarching umbrella of everything that we do is related to safety. And that initiative happened and started right around 2003. And as you can see, when you focus and you establish measures and targets and try to get at things, some amazing things can happen. You know, and I'll say some of it has to do with the way we approach things. I think some of it would just happen to be, you know, a result of maybe the greater world events that are going on. And so, you know, the economy slows down, people travel less, and so people don't travel as much. And that's probably had something to do with the reduction of these crashes. But when I look at what Minnesota's done over the last 15 years compared to other states, we're one of the few states that has a pretty consistent downward trend. And so I think we're doing some unique things here that have given us the results that are on the screen here. You know, we did come up short last year of trying to reach our goal of fewer than 350 fatalities on our roadway. But we did reestablish a new goal in 2020 to basically get our number of fatalities down to 300. And, you know, people will say, well, you know, it sounds real aggressive or it sounds, you know, not aggressive enough, depending on how you view things. But basically all we need to do is we need to eliminate 1 fatality a month for 5 years in order to reach that goal of 300 by 2020. And so from my perspective, I think that's pretty attainable. I think that we should be able to do that. And I was one of those people that said, geez, I'd like to set a little more aggressive goal, but I don't get to make all the calls in terms of our goals and objectives that are part of this program. But we presented some options to a steering committee, and they agreed that fewer than 300 by 2020 would be something to shoot for, and if we achieve that earlier, we'll reevaluate our goal and move forward. So, Strategic Highway Safety Plan, what is it? What it is a comprehensive look at the crash picture of what's occurring in the state. And so our focus, our measure of effectiveness is fatal and serious injury crashes. And so it's not your rear end crashes at a signalized intersection where we're repairing bumpers and maybe replacing trunks on vehicles. No, what we're trying to get at is we're trying to get at the crashes that either somebody doesn't go home at the end of the day, or eventually when they do make it back home, their quality of life has been impacted. So they've lost functionality, they've long-term disability, you have to have long-term care types of things. And so our goal is those fatal and serious injury crashes. And what you won't find in the Strategic Highway Safety Plan is saying this is the worst intersection in the state and this is the fix that needs to be done here. Instead, what you'll find is you'll find a framework to say, you know what, here's the opportunities to make the biggest impact on reducing those crashes. And then locally, what we want people to do is we want to leverage this framework and say, what's going on in my community, in my county, in my district, in my part of the state, and how can I use the resources in the Strategic Highway Safety Plan to help us move forward and do things locally. Because in all honesty, I can sit here and say from the great state of Minnesota's perspective, this is what we should be doing. But actually making things happen is really a function at the local level of people taking a leadership role and pursuing opportunities to make improvements in the transportation system that'll pay off, and in this term, and pay off in terms of reducing crashes. And so let's talk a little bit about the stakeholder input, because that was one thing with the new legislation that came out that required each of the states to develop a strategic highway safety plan. One of the things they wanted us to do is they wanted us to engage the community in helping establish some of the priorities. And that was probably the biggest change from the 2007 Strategic Highway Safety Plan from the one we did in 2014. In 2007 plan, we were basically exclusively relied on the data and looked at the opportunities that were there, and we didn't have so much of a community or stakeholder outreach to the level that we did in our 2014 update. And so, again, it's a Minnesota plan, and when we talk about safety, we usually talk about the 4 E's: people in engineering, enforcement, education and emergency medical services, and we added a fifth E because there's a lot of other people that are out there, and so instead of coming up with lots more E's, we just said and everybody else. So we relied on our four main, professions or areas, and then we also had mayors, we had county commissioners, we had state legislators, we had advocacy groups that fell in that everyone else category. And the other thing that we were charged to do is we were charged to coordinate with other existing plans that were in place. And so as you can imagine, there's state plans, there's regional plans, there's local plans. And so what we did is we spent an awful lot of time looking at existing state and local safety plans to see what was going on in there, what things could we take from that and elevate up to the state level and say, hey, these are best practices, these are some things that are going on in the area, to highlight the ties and the coordination to existing plans and programs. And I'll still, as part of my job and as part of the Federal Highways Administration's Everyday Counts initiative, crash data, localized data is really the key to making decisions. So 90% of our decisions were made using crash data, so the motor vehicle crash reports that were submitted to the Department of Public Safety was the basis for a lot of our analysis. That 10% came from the stakeholder input and other things. And so crash data is still the most important factor in what we use to craft our structure and our decisions is how we move forward. But also providing that stakeholder perspective highlights some things and opportunities we might not get from the crash data. And so how we do this stakeholder output? What we did is we had some TZD, Towards Zero Deaths, workshops throughout the state. And so we went to the 8 different areas of the state, and we had some workshops where we brought people in and basically put them through a series of exercises, some structured exercises, in order to get their opinions in a somewhat objective manner to see where we stood as a community in terms of where our priorities should be. We also kicked off the whole updating process with a visioning session where we invited international speakers to come in and talk about things that are going on in Europe and things that are going on in other parts of the country, so we could be on the cutting edge and say, hey, here's where we're going as a state, or here's where we're going as a country. We had car manufacturers come in and say, here's where we're going as an industry, to kind of set the stage for, hey, what should we do? What can we do to be visionary in terms of developing this new plan? And so when I talk about crash data, we look at those 22 focus areas, and usually if you're involved in a crash, it involves more than one of those focus areas. So you could be a teenage driver that ran a stop sign at an intersection and T-boned a elderly driver who wasn't wearing their seatbelt. And so you had an opportunity to look at 4 of those different focus areas. And so what we want to do is we want to try to capture how many of those focus areas can we impact with the limited funds that we have. And so those interconnections are really what we're trying to look at and exploit in order to be most effective. Because, I get asked, well, Brad, if I give you $1 million, how many lives can you save? The answer is, I don't know. I could do a few things on 100 miles of road, or I could do one thing at 50 foot of road. It depends on what the solution is. And so it's not an easy, well, how much money does it cost to save a life calculation. And so what we need to do is we need to figure out how we can spread the funds over the focus areas so that we're impacting bicyclists and motor vehicles and motorcyclists and pedestrians, and try to make sure that we're getting as much coverage as we can. And so when we look at those things, here's just a little simple breakdown of what occurs at intersections. 9% of our fatal crashes that occur at intersections are rear end related. And so to me that tells me, 90% of them are not rear end crashes. And so my focus probably isn't trying to eliminate 9% of those rear end crashes at signalized intersection. That's probably not where I should invest my time and energy. Instead, maybe that 40% that are those T-bone right angle crashes probably tells me, hey, these are the crash types we should be looking at. And what can we do to mitigate that? We could separate the movements. We can make sure people comply with stop signs or signals. There's lots of things that we can do to help people out. And so this is where we get into the details of, again, taking this type of information, making it local, and figuring out what you can do at your local level. So the crash types are one thing, but then we also have to look at drivers also make choices, and what kind of choices are they making when bad things happen? And so, we have things like inattentive driving. We have people that are driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol. We have people that are driving too fast for the conditions, and all those things kind of, again, you start to roll them all together and you can see how it can get pretty complex. So in the past we might say, well, we're going to do a speed-related enforcement program, and that's going to solve our problems. Well, okay, we did the speed-related enforcement, but we still have the impaired drivers that are going on. Or we want to focus on unbelted people. And so again, a singular focus is good, and it's good for administering programs at a local and national level. But I would venture to say if we could be a little more comprehensive and look at things, maybe we can get those inattentive drivers that aren't wearing their seatbelts with the same enforcement program instead of having two different focuses that are there. And so hopefully what you can see is this isn't just a roadway problem. And so a lot of times people say, well, you're at the DOT, Brad, why do you worry about drunk drivers, or why do you worry about distracted driving? And really what it is it's a part of that comprehensive program. Yeah, I'm going to spend my money to make roadway improvements, and yeah, my partners at the Department of Public Safety are going to spend their time and energy making sure that people comply with the laws that are out there. But how can we overlap these things so when we do things we're complementing each other instead of working in our silos? And so that was kind of how we got at the objective data, saying, hey, here's what the crash data tells us. And then we had those two exercises where we asked the communities, hey, what do you think should be our priorities? And so we basically did a head-to-head challenge and said, you know what, in terms of reducing fatal and serious injury crashes, we'd give them a couple categories and say, what do you think is most important in terms of reducing fatal and serious injury crashes? So they got these little clickers, they're sitting out in the audience, and we pop something up on the screen and would say, okay, tell me which one out of these two categories are going to make a bigger impact in terms of reducing fatal and serious injury crashes, focusing on younger drivers, focusing on older drivers. Then we do the similar thing. We'd say, how about younger drivers and impaired drivers? How about motorcycles or intersections? And so we went through all 22 combinations of the focus areas that were out there and basically said, where's it at? And at the end of the day, we're able to come up and we're able to get the perspective of the community in terms of where the hierarchy might be. So then the other one, and I talked a little bit earlier about how we looked at those connections. We had an exercise called the game of loans. And really what we're trying to do there is we're trying to make people step out of their comfort zone, and we're trying to get them to say, how can we optimize our resources? So tell us where you guys think things are connected. And so we're looked at a way to say, okay, everybody divides up into your 22 focus areas. And in your focus areas, you each have $100. At the end of the day, you have to give away your $100. You tell me where you want to put your $100 in the other areas, other 21 focus areas that are out there. And then so that we can maximize the potential reduction in fatal and serious injury crashes. And so it was a pretty interesting exercise. We had some people that tried to actually manufacture additional money because they wanted to filter it to certain focus areas. But again, it gives us an opportunity to look at the relationships that are out there. And so now we've got objective crash data that says, hey, this is where things are occurring, and here are the connections we can drive from the crash data. We've got this community output and outreach that we did that also did a similar activity. It said, here's where we think the priorities are, and here's where we think the connections are at. And so, yeah, here's just kind of an overview of where it's at. And so, as I mentioned earlier, 97% of our fatal and serious injury crashes involved more than one focus area. So again, that singular approach saying, hey, this is the way. If we only focused on this one thing, we could do it. And so that was kind of what we leveraged from them. And so now we've got different methods, different ways to look at it. And so a lot of times people say, well, Brad, just use all crashes. You got 75,000 crashes a year that occur in the state. Just crunch the numbers, tell us where to go, and we'll be able to do that. And so what I wanted to do with this slide is kind of demonstrate, if we looked at just our fatal crashes, or in this case it's called K for people that were killed. So this is a crash that involved one or more people getting killed. And we looked at the frequency of crashes that fall in the various focus areas. We would say that impaired driving would be our #1 priority in terms of reducing fatal and serious injury crashes. If we throw in those serious injury crashes where people are seriously injured, quality of life isn't there, you know, the ranking doesn't change a whole heck of a lot. You know, you kind of see it's divided into 3 tiers, and so young drivers kind of drop down a little bit when you include the K&A crashes, or sorry, just the fatal crashes, and so it gives you that perspective. But look what happens when we throw in all crashes. And then when we throw in all crashes, all of a sudden your impaired road drivers probably aren't that big of a deal in the greater context of it. You know, and your motorcyclists probably aren't that big of a deal. And so again, when you focus in on a certain goal or objective, you can develop a program to really get at that. And so my peers in a lot of other states, they like to use that all crash column because you know what, there's strength in numbers, and we can come up with statistical significance to say, hey, this is what's going on. And in Minnesota, we really tried to use the fatal crashes and the fatal and serious injury crashes to shape our focus. And so, and here's part of the reason why. If we look at just the frequency of where these crashes occur versus the probability of that crash resulting in a bad outcome, you know, here are the types of crash where, you know, me as an EMT, me as a firefighter, if I get called out for somebody we know that's unbelted, I get called out to a motorcyclist crash, I get called out to a pedestrian or a bicyclist, I'm thinking bad things. I'm thinking blood on the pavement. I'm thinking we got to call the trauma center, let them know we're going to go, maybe get the trauma team activation going on. And so these are the crashes that when they occur, the outcome is usually bad. But if we would look at that totally on a frequency basis, we'd never look at bicyclists or pedestrians or motorcyclists because the sheer number isn't there compared to our motor vehicle crashes. If we flip this around and we look at some opportunities, and so let's ignore the lane departure on the left and the older drivers on the right, but our intersection-related crashes, yeah, we kill people at intersections, but a lot of our crashes occur at intersections. You know, our inattentive drivers, do we kill a lot of people with inattentive drivers? We kill some. You know, you all hear about the people that are texting and driving, or reaching for their cell phone, or talking to the kid in the back seat. And so these crashes, when they occur, you know, the outcome isn't as drastic on a probability basis. And so again, we kind of presented this information to a steering committee and said, help us provide some direction as to where we want to go. Lane departure crashes, when people leave the roadway, usually bad things happen. They either hit another vehicle, they hit a tree, they roll over in a ditch. And so, you know, again, you got that differential there from the lane departure crash compared to maybe some of the other crash types that are there. And then older drivers, when they get involved in crashes, they're just not as durable as you and I are. Most of the people in here don't fall in the older driver category. So if we get involved in a crash, we might have a sore neck, we might have a bruise here or there, but we're not going to die. We're not going to be put in a nursing home as a result of those injuries. And so when an older driver gets involved in a crash, the probability of it falling in that severe category is a little bit higher. And so, again, just a different perspective. We could look at raw numbers, we can look at these kind of proportions, but at the end of the day, you know, sample size, yeah, size does matter, but I don't need those 73,000 crashes a year to make my decision. You know, I need maybe those 400 crashes plus those 1,400 severe crashes, and I can get a pretty good idea of where our program should focus in on. Now, I've seen Gary. Gary's in here. Gary likes to work with 73,000 crashes because we can crank out a lot of data and discover a lot of things. And there's a role for that. I'm not here to tell you that looking at all crashes isn't a good thing to do. But when your safety program is focused on eliminating fatal and serious injury crashes, I'm going to go with those smaller 2 dots there. I'm going to work with the data I have to help me drive my program and make my decisions. So why do we have multiple perspectives? You know, the federal highway was pretty clear that we needed to consult with our stakeholders. And so what I like to look at this as, I like to say the crash data tells us what has happened. So it's written down in a crash report, it's recorded, it's out there. But the stakeholders might be able to give us a little bit of an inkling as to what things aren't reported in a crash report, or maybe what things were on the horizon. When I went back and I looked at the 2007 Strategic Highway Safety Plan, we talked about distracted driving. We were talking about people talking on a cell phone, people being distracted by roadside objects, things like that. Texting really wasn't the epidemic that it is nowadays. And so, but in working with the stakeholders, you know, we're able to kind of come up on, hey, here are some things that we see going on right now that might give us that forward-looking perspective to say, you know what, this might be a little problem now, but if we can get on top of some of these things, maybe it won't become a real big problem like it, you know, like once the crash data catches up and we're able to associate or to talk about that. And so that's the beauty of having crash data to give us a retrospective look, and the stakeholders to give us a prospective look in terms of what things might be on the horizon. So me, I'm thinking, okay, well, last thing I want is things not to align. And so I was really worried about this whole stakeholder perspective, because I'm like, what if the stakeholders come back and they say exactly opposite of what our data says? Now I got a public relations nightmare, and how am I going to manage this? Luckily, or maybe fortunately, or maybe we just have a very intelligent community out there, but you know, we kind of put these into high, medium, and low priorities from the crash data perspective. So gold was kind of our, hey, this is where we get the biggest bang for our buck. Red is, hey, these things are probably of moderate concern, and blue is, well, these aren't real high on our list in terms of where things are at. And so the crash data tells us what's out there. If we look at the stakeholder perceptions, boy, those things align pretty good. And you know, where was the stakeholder perception maybe a little higher than the crash data? Inattentive driving, that's the one that jumped out to me. And I'll tell you the number one reason why is because people don't self-report inattentive driving. So if you were involved in a motor vehicle crash and the officer came up and said, hey, you know, what were you doing before that? You're going to say, oh, you know, I was driving down the road, I didn't see that guy and I hit him. And you're going to say, oh, I was texting on my phone, or, you know, trying to pick up the bottle of Gatorade that fell on the floor. So that's another strength of not everything is always reported in the crash data for us to obtain. And so you need to rely on those perspectives as well. We've made a lot of progress in the last 5 years in Minnesota in terms of reducing the frequency of our younger drivers being involved in motor vehicle crashes. But there's still a stigma out there that says younger drivers are bad drivers, and quite frankly they are. They're still going to wreck cars, but they're not killing people as much as they could. And then I'll call a little bit of this on sampling bias as well. The older drivers, they were very well represented in our stakeholder group. And boy, they didn't want to admit that they were bad drivers. So when we ran the numbers, there are actually more older drivers getting killed per year than younger drivers. And so we presented that to them, and they said, well, yeah, but we should focus on our future. You know, we're kind of on the tail end of our, so let's focus on the young folks. And so it was interesting to get the various perspectives from each of the stakeholders. Now, when we looked at the connections that were up there, so these are the relationships. You know, we had those 22 focus areas, and so from the crash data, we can highlight some of those connections. So, for example, there are 6 other focus areas that are really connected to intersections. When we did the stakeholder perception, you know, there was 4, and so there were lots of connections, and those things are a little bit harder to discern and understand. And I think that's where we have an opportunity to get into the data a little bit more and maybe understand these intricacies as to how we can be more effective. But really, you know, things aligned really well. And this is one of my favorite ways to represent these connections. And so here are 18 of the 22 focus areas that are up on the screen. And so what we did is we charted all of the perceptions that we got from our stakeholders. And so if there's a dotted blue line from one area to another, this is where, when we went out and did that community outreach, they said that these are things that we think are connected or correlated. If you look at that inattention thing on the right side of your screen, it goes to darn near every other focus areas out there. So the public thinks if we could just take care of inattentive driving, all of our problems would be solved. They also have similar feelings about the impaired driving as well. One thing that I found really interesting is our community doesn't have a really good feel or opinion as to what's going on with our bicyclist-related crashes. Nobody really gave us any feedback as to what's going on with that. Otherwise, every other focus area that was on there is tied to something else in some level. Now, let's look at what the crash data tells us. Not nearly as many lines that are on there. Definitely not as many lines that are coming out from our inattentive driving area. Again, I'll say that's probably underreported, so that's where you can consider your data source and try to make some intelligent decisions moving forward. but a lot less of those opportunities that are out there. Now, I work quite closely with my friends over at the Department of Public Safety, and most of the time when you hear their marketing or their public service announcements, they talk about wearing your seatbelt, don't driving drunk, driving the speed limit, and paying attention. So if you look at the impaired driving straight across the screen, crash data supports that impaired driving and unbelted driving, there's a strong correlation there. If you take your impaired driving and you go down 45 degrees, you got that correlation between the speed, you got your speed and your unbelted. And so, you know, there's some good science into their messaging and trying to get at that multiple perspectives that are validated with the crash data. So, you know, from a marketing perspective, you can use this data to probably craft some pretty good messages. But what we need to consider is when we overlay these things, this is where the community opinions or assessments overlay with the crash data. And so from a messaging standpoint, from an education standpoint, you can look at those things and say, you know what, if you want to talk about the correlation between unbelted, impaired, and speeding drivers, public's probably going to accept that. They believe that, at least their attitudes they responded to on this survey overlaid with the crash data. But if you try to make a tie between pedestrians and speeding, it's not there. The public might think it's there, and they might demand that if you just slow traffic down, the pedestrians would be better, but it's not supported with the data. The public assessment's there, and so that gives us an opportunity to either examine, is the data not telling us the correct story, or do we need to work on educating the public as to the things that are correlated with these crashes? So these things here are really easy sells. The challenge is what do you do with everything else that doesn't align and doesn't overlap. And so in this case, a lot of times when prom season comes up, they want to focus, let's do an education campaign on teenage drinking and driving. And again, you got that blue line there that says, you know what, people believe that's perceptions there, but really there are a relatively few number of minors that are engaging in drinking and driving that result in killing people. Does it happen? Yes. Does it happen at a significant level? Probably not. Should our safety program focus on something like that? My assessment would be that that would probably be a low return on investment, and we could use our money elsewhere to again gain a better outcome. So a couple interesting things here: commercial vehicles and inattention. Really strong correlation is there. Now that doesn't mean that inattention causes people to commit commercial vehicles, and it also doesn't mean commercial vehicle drivers are inattentive. So this isn't a cause and effect relationship. These are just simply things that are correlated. So in your statistics classes, correlation doesn't equate to causation, but it gives us an idea of where we have opportunities to impact multiple areas with that. So let's talk a little bit about coordinating this plan, and then how does it impact other plans, and then how does it move things forward. So what we decided to do is we decided to take a bullseye approach. In the 2007 plan, we focused in on our highest opportunity to make impacts on focus areas. So we had 5 to 7 really focused in areas. For this go around, we decided, you know what, we're going to include all 22 into our plan. And part of that was strategic, because if you want to use safety money from the federal government, they're going to say, show me where it's at in your strategic highway safety plan that this is an eligible or this is a priority for your state. And so we decided, you know what, we want to put them all in there to some level so that we can say they're all in there, they're all available, and then we'll manage how we distribute our funds based on that. And so what we decided to do is use a bullseye approach and say, you know what, we really want to hit that middle of that bullseye as much as we can. But you know what, there's added value if we get things that are maybe not in the bullseye, maybe on the outer ring of the bullseye. There's still an opportunity and there's still a role in terms of targeting our safety improvements. But if we want to maximize our score, we want to shoot for the middle of that bullseye. Now, the data helped us determine where some of these priorities were at, but there are some things that the data has a hard time quantifying. In particular, unlicensed drivers, if we give somebody a driver's license, if they have a valid driver's license, that's hard to evaluate in the crash data. Work zones. So these things here, I guess what I'm trying to say is these things here aren't quantified very well by looking at the crash data. So for example, for me to have a robust analysis system, to have a strong crash database that has quality data, I can't equate that to saving a life. And so these are some things that kind of are along for the ride that support a safety program, support an effort to work on things out there. And so these things aren't quantifiable by the crash data. So we had to rely on our steering committee to help us determine where these landed on the bullseye. And so basically, here's where our prioritization came out. And so when we look in the middle there, again, these are our high impact, high frequency types of occurrences. So we've got our inattentive driving, we've got our unbelted drivers, we've got our impaired drivers, our intersection crashes, our lane departure crashes, and our speeding related crashes that are on the outer ring of that center bullseye. I'm going to talk about the safety culture and awareness a little bit later. That's the center of our bullseye, and there's a reason that it's there. But then we go to our next tier, and this is where, you know, our red tier is where our motorcycles, our pedestrians, our older drivers, younger drivers, some of our data management systems fall in line. And then on the outer ring are probably our crashes that don't occur a lot, but when they do occur, the outcome's usually not too good. So our crashes involving people hitting trains and people hitting bicyclists, and our crashes in work zones. And so that's kind of our focus area or priority. And so at the end of the day, we tie our safety money to where these various focus areas are at. And so when we get the opportunity, we want to spring towards the middle of the bullseye whenever we get a chance. And so what our charge was is we needed to say, okay, what existing plans are out there, and what are they doing in each of those focus areas? And so we looked at 17 different plans. So there's 7 MPO plans in the state, and there's a whole bunch of other plans that are done at a state or regional level. The Minnesota State Patrol has a strategic plan. The Department of Public Safety's office. I manage a highway safety improvement plan at the DOT. Our trauma systems from the EMS side has a plan. So we read a bunch of plans and we said, okay, what are you guys doing in each of those focus areas? And it was pretty interesting to see the magnitude and scope of the different projects that were identified at the local level that got to a specific focus area. 2 areas that were really, really underrepresented in terms of the plans that we reviewed were work zone related issues and unlicensed drivers. And so those 2 topics, there was a total of 1 plan, and that was MnDOT's plan to look at work zone crashes. And so that identified an opportunity to me to say, okay, what can we do? What do we need to do to start having some action, some implementation in the work zone area and in the unlicensed driver area? And so now let's talk about what your role is in the Strategic Highway Safety Plan and where it's at. So I call this the magical world of traffic safety. And so a lot of the people that I work with and I interact with fall in one of these agencies, and I can add a lot more dots on here for the people I forgot, but this is just an illustrative example. And really what it is, it's a big network. It's a big community. And so the great thing about this is there are lots of relationships that existed. Now theoretically, if everybody here interacted with everybody else on this chart, that'd be a heck of a web to weave. Or if you look at that as a sweater, you could say, you know what, say somebody at the Minnesota State Patrol who was a leader in traffic safety retires, and I pull that string out of this web. Guess what's going to happen? This thing's still going to be in place. The structure's still going to be there for us to be successful. And so we can bring somebody in, we can replace that State Patrol person, and they can build on the existing relationships that are there. If these relationships don't exist and we work in our silos, then you're really at a risk for being losing technical expertise, losing the synergy that exists. And so this is a good way for us to look at all of our partners and what their roles are. And you know, just like anything, the larger your network, the more contacts you have, probably the more effective you're going to be, whether it's getting a job, getting a program, maybe floating an idea and getting acceptance, or somebody saying, hey, I'm willing to try that. And so looking at this complex web, really there's ways for you to leverage some economies moving forward, and if something does go awry, you don't fall flat on your face because your partner's there to pick you up. And so I told you I was going to talk a little bit about traffic safety culture and how to change a culture. And so really that's the center of the focus that we're trying to get at over the next 5 years, is to start implementing, I'll call it a pro-traffic safety culture in this state. So it has nothing to do with building bigger and better roads. It really has to do about making us as a state, making us as a community, making us as an individual responsible for our actions. And so, you know, how can we do that? And I guess the best way I can look at it is look at your role and what you do. So Polk County, their county engineer, had a request from a local bar to close down a county road that went through a small town for an annual street dance. In the past, it's just a permit. You go in, you fill it in, and you basically let law enforcement know, hey, we're going to close this road. The county says, yep, that's fine. It's not a detour or anything that's going on there. Give the permit back and says, here you go. Go ahead and close it down, have a good time. Well, one of our leaders out in Polk County, his name is Rich Sanders, he's the county engineer out there. He says, you know what, this is an opportunity for me to start making them think about things in terms of traffic safety. So rural Minnesota, small town community, they usually have a street dance. What goes with street dances? Beer gardens. So he says, hey, you know what, I want to make sure that everybody that's working at your beer garden, as a condition of getting this permit, goes through alcohol server training and identifies when people have been overserved alcohol and cuts them off. And oh, by the way, I want you to work with the local cab companies in the community next door to make sure people got a ride home. And oh, by the way, I want to make sure that, you know, and so he put 3 or 4 different things in here that really had nothing to do with closing the road, but really had an impact on making sure that people there are thinking about things in terms of traffic safety. So let's not let anybody leave your event who's impaired. Let's make sure people that are there don't have the opportunity to become too impaired to get a ride home. And if they are too impaired to get a ride home, then let's figure out a way to get them home safely. Had nothing to do with closing the road, but leverage that opportunity, leverage those relationships, and said, hey, you know what, this is what we should be thinking about. And so what I have to, you know, I guess the challenge for us today is, what can we do individually as for the Strategic Highway Safety Plan? You know, if you're a professor, what can you do? If you're a parent, what can you do? You know, you can set in a good example for how to drive. You know, I've got 8-year-old daughters and a 5-year-old daughter, and they ask me, Daddy, what's the speed limit here? Daddy, what's the speed limit here? Daddy, why is your seatbelt not, you know, fastened? And so you're a role model as a parent. You know, you can be an advocate, you can be a friend, you can be a peer, you can host a party and make sure people get the opportunity to go home. You can choose to obey the speed limit on the road. If you're an employer, you can have strong pro-traffic safety policies. You know, at the DOT right now, technically we're discouraged from using our cell phones while driving on the road. We all know that cell phones cause distractions, and we know distractions lead to crashes, and crashes lead to death. So what's preventing us at the DOT from implementing a policy that says, you know what, if you're driving a DOT vehicle, you're not going to use your phone? You know, and so there are opportunities, depending on what your role is, where you can try to be a leader and you can try to implement change that are pro-traffic safety. And that could be you as a supervisor enforcing rules and regulations for your company. It could be you as a policymaker saying, geez, what kind of impact is this policy going to have on the transportation system in terms of traffic safety? Or it could be, you know what, hey, I'm an advocate and I want things to get better for traffic safety, and I'm going to support a lower blood alcohol level for impairment, or I'm going to, you know, get up here and let them know that this isn't the best legislation in terms of traffic safety. So we all have a different role. It just depends on where you have an opportunity to do that and what influences you can make. And so that's part of the thing that'll never show up on a report. They'll say, you know what, hey, we were able to do these things, or people got home, and so this is tough to quantify. But I think if we start with the traffic safety culture and we start building on that, then we'll be able to get over some of these hurdles that have been difficult for us to get over in the past. If we look back, 20, 30, 40 years ago, I'd be sitting in this room and maybe half of you'd be smoking a cigarette and drinking a cocktail while I'm delivering this presentation. Today that just simply isn't accepted and is unacceptable. And so how can we make that transition from where it was 30, 40 years ago with smoking and drinking to where we want to be in 20, 30, 40 years from now in terms of people being pro-traffic safety? So we talked a little bit about the Strategic Highway Safety Plan and the Minnesota TZD program. So there's a couple links that are up there for each of those. And with that, I'll turn it over to anybody that has any questions.
Anybody who has a question, why don't you raise your hand and we'll get you a mic.
Lee Munich, Humphrey School. We know that about, we have a primary seatbelt law and 90% of people wear seatbelts, but yet we have that 10% that don't, and those represent a high proportion of the fatalities. Is there a way of notching that up? I mean, can we get to that final 10%? And a lot of those are teenagers that don't do it. I mean, is there, have you thought about additional ways beyond what we have right now in law and enforcement to be able to get at that?
So, some of the study and literature out there says once you start reaching that 90 to 92, 94% saturation rate, are you ever going to get that last chunk that's out there? And I think, I think that there are opportunities to do that. I think technology may have a role in it. Where if we get to a vehicle that won't move until everybody that sets off a seat sensor, their seatbelt's buckled. Or I think there are ways to get there. I think that there are folks that are just adamant that I'm not going to wear this, and if it's my personal choice not to do that, and so those people will be impacted a little bit. But I think that the human interaction of clicking my seatbelt. We've got probably most of them that we can, and I think that we'll have to look for alternative means in order to increase that number moving forward.
Nicole Morris, Human First. So there's a big perception around the importance and sort of problem pending about inattention. The data doesn't support it, but there's this big assumption that it's underreported, right? Well, speed is also, I imagine, really underreported, but the data is there. So I'm just wondering what the thought is that we know speed is a problem, but we really haven't even grasped the magnitude. Right. And so rather than, dividing our eggs into a bucket that we just assume is a problem, but it's not backed up by the data, diverting it into something that we know is a problem and potentially much bigger.
Yeah, so the data is very clear that speed is a major contributor in these things. But boy, you want to get a lot of pushback, and I'll go back to the perceptions that were out there. People perceive that speed was a problem, but we all need to get somewhere quickly. We all need to get somewhere, Jimmy John's freaky fast, right? And so they want to get there. And so people view speed and efficiency as a good thing, and it can be if it's done safely. But that's where if we can take that step and say, culturally, which do we value more? Speed and efficiency or safety? Right now our society is saying speed and efficiency is really important, and safety, well, maybe we're okay to do that. They won't come out and directly say that, but really that's what their core values are saying is we want to get things done quickly and fast. And if people die, well, then that's just an outcome of that. And so I think if we can start working on that culture where people will say, it's okay if it gets here in 5.5 minutes versus 3 minutes, then maybe we can get that balance and that trade-off that occurs there. But speed is a tough one. We've been working on it for 5 years, and there's a lot of people that have a lot of different opinions about speed, and so there's an opportunity there that we need to work on. We need to keep working on.
Side note, I think we should campaign and lobby our local radio stations to stop airing a Jimmy John's commercial that glorifies speeding and
Right.
a cop pulling him over and how wonderful that is. But
Right.
that's just
side note.
I agree.
Any other questions?
So around the Twin Cities, we're starting to see more like metro transit presence. Have you seen a crash reduction with more public transit?
Yeah, it's that is a topic that we're looking to investigate. And so, you know, when you look at the modes of transportation, our buses usually aren't involved in the fatal and serious injury crashes, and so that's a good thing. But what does happen is you increase the number of pedestrians or bicyclists if you're going to go intermodal with public transportation. And so, I think that, you know, there are overall, I think that more utilization of public transit can result in a fatal and serious reduction in crashes, but we haven't done a study to quantify that impact quite yet.
Greg Lindsay, I'm at the Humphrey School. There's an organization called 880 that was set up by the founder who started these open streets types of activities. And one of their arguments is that if we reduce the speed in residential neighborhoods to 20 miles an hour, you'd change a lot of injuries or fatalities to injuries. And I'm curious about your perspective on that particular policy recommendation. They seem to advocate it as a blanket sort of approach.
Yeah, so the faster you go, the higher the forces, the higher probability of serious injury and death. So that's just the basic law of physics. If you can get people to slow down, I'm all for it. But how do you get people to slow down is the challenge. It's more than going out there and just changing the numbers on the sign and saying, ta-da, we're done. Because the speed differential is really where it gets difficult for pedestrians and bicyclists to interact with traffic, because you can have somebody come in this direction at 40 miles an hour, somebody come in this direction at 80 miles an hour, and you can start walking across the street and get by the 40 mile an hour car and get plucked by the 80 mile an hour car. And so I think if you need to have the consistency and the harmony in order to have that environment work well. And so that usually involves making physical changes to the roadway to get people to adapt their speeds that are appropriate for the conditions. And so that's the challenge. I won't dispute that, you know, I'd rather get hit with a baseball thrown at me at 20 miles an hour versus 80 miles an hour. And the same goes for, you know, a vehicle. I don't want to hit by a vehicle, period. But if I do have to take a choice, would like to have a slower vehicle. Yes.
This is a question from one of our online viewers. What is the connection between your state highway safety plan and MnDOT's highway safety improvement plan?
It's a good question. So the connection is most of my highway safety improvement program dollars are tied to crashes that involve intersections and lane departure, which are in the middle of that bullseye, the yellow part. Let me see if I can find it. So ideally, I would like most of my highway safety improvement dollars to end up in that yellow area. And so since my money with the highway safety improvement program is basically used for infrastructure improvements, I'd be making improvements at intersections and helping people stay in their lane and stay on the road. Now that doesn't mean I can't do things for pedestrians, bicyclists. We have some money that's set aside for trained vehicle crashes as well. But again, when I shoot my arrows, I'm going for the gold. And I try to hit there as much as I can. So that does influence our project selection in terms of where we're investing money.
You know, we're running out of time. Please join with me in thanking Brad Astosian for his most interesting talk. Thank you. I just want to leave you with two quick thoughts. Those students who are registered for credit, you want to summarize this particular talk today. You'll have until 1 p.m. next Wednesday to submit your abstract or your one-page summary as described in the syllabus. And last but not least, our speaker next week is Professor Gary Davis, who's sitting right here, and he'll be talking on characterizing uncertainty in left-turn crash reconstructions using event data recorder data. That's next week, 3 o'clock, same room or same website if you're off in TV land. Thank you very much for coming. Have a good day. Anybody here who has questions, who's registered for the class, who can come see